Today is Friday, March 26th, 2021, and you are listening to the 65th broadcast of TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. My name's Dr. Edward DeVries. I'm a contributing editor at TBR, the Barnes Review magazine, and for the next hour, I'll be your host here on the TBR History Hour. Our guest today is my fellow TBR contributing editor, Clint Lacy, the president and owner of Foothills Media, foothillsmedia.net. And Clint and I will be talking about his excellent article that appeared in the March-April issue of TBR magazine, that being titled Saving South Carolina. The Saving South Carolina article. You always write about Missouri and things that happen in the Ozarks. Yeah. You know, maybe you venture off a little bit into Arkansas. What inspired you to write about South Carolina?
Yep. Probably I've just been digging through a lot of newspaper articles lately, and I think I just kind of stumbled across this and started digging deeper and deeper, and well, once I start something, I can't really stop. So this article is a result of that, and I knew bits and pieces of it before, but I really got a real good sense of what happened once I embarked on researching this. And it actually starts off with William Seward, who people don't know, he was actually running for president of the United States the same time Lincoln was in 1860. And it starts off with an article that was found in the October 13th, 1860 issue of the Emporia News, Emporia, Kansas. And this article contained a speech that Seward was given in Kansas, and it was quite inflammatory. And if you like, I can read you part of this. Or
yeah, go ahead.
This is Seward speaking to a crowd in Kansas. There is a population enough in Kansas now to make Missouri a great state. But Missouri does not want to be a great state. She prefers to wait and be a slave state, which it says the crowd laughs at this point. She has no affection for the people of the North, but a great affection for the people of the South. She has no affection for free labor, but a great affection for slave labor. She has no free speech. She is satisfied to have what she may say or may not controlled by the slave power. This is a sad case for Missouri, but not hopeless. She must look for deliverance to Kansas, which Missouri refused to let come into the Union, but which is drawing immigration through Missouri and opening the way and marking out the very course and inviting Missouri on and calling upon Eastern capitalists to build a national highway to Pikes Peak in California. Missouri is richer by millions by the settlement of Kansas by free men. All of her hopes of competition with the free northern states are based upon what you are doing and can do and will do to make a Pacific Railroad. Never was the policy of any state more suicidal, for either she is to be forever a slave state as she desires, or she had better have been free from the beginning. Seward is stoking the fires here, and it's just typical political drama whipping up crowds, and like a typical politician, he's lying. Missouri was not increased by millions because of Kansas. Missouri was wealthier than Kansas because of its traditions and the policies that were already there. Once Kansas started opening up, as you know, they had the Immigrant Aid Society in New England, and they would entice people and pay people to go to Kansas to settle. They pretty much promising a paradise, and when the people got out there, there was nothing there. No jobs, no real way to make money, and when the funding ran out, they were poor. And what really happened was, you know, Kansas was starting to become this socialist society. through the immigration of New Englanders. And as they're getting poorer, they look across the border at Missouri and start becoming jealous of its wealth. And as far as Missouri taking orders from slave powers, that wasn't the case. And compared to many states, Missouri had a lot fewer slaves. And, later on during the Civil War, War of Northern Aggression, the percentage of Confederates that owned slaves in Missouri was very, very small. There were, however, a lot of Unionists that stayed in the Union thinking they could keep their slaves by doing so. So this is how I got involved in South Carolina. It was actually researching something from Missouri, and I stumbled across his speech. But Seward wasn't interested in peace. He wanted power. He wanted the power to see the people he despised the most, Southerners, punished. Seward, at one time the leading candidate for the Republican nomination in 1860, did not win, but he did manage to land the position of Secretary of State in the Abraham Lincoln administration, where he was able to maneuver Confederate forces into firing on Fort Sumter off South Carolina.
Make the connection for me between Missouri and South Carolina.
All right. So Seward's in Kansas in October 1860, speaking to this crowd, telling them their enemy is Missouri and their enemy are Southerners, and that Missouri takes their orders from Southerners. At the same time, you've got South Carolina trying to secede peacefully. And what hinges on that is Fort Sumter. And before the election of Lincoln, South Carolina actually provisioned Fort Sumter, which was, still garrisoned by the Union Army. They allowed them to buy supplies from Charleston. So they were trying to avoid war. But as I got into this article, I learned that Seward was pretty much plotting to get South Carolina to fire the first shot.
Mm-hmm. So Seward, then, having served prior to Abraham Lincoln, was essentially what we would call today a swamp creature.
Yeah, he was the traditional swamp creature, yes.
And so apparently Abraham Lincoln made the same mistake that Donald Trump made, or maybe it wasn't so much a mistake as simply an inability, and that is they both failed to drain the swamp.
I don't know if Lincoln ever wanted to drain the swamp, but he was definitely a creature of the swamp too. I mean, he was a lawyer previously, and Lincoln himself said, "If I can save the Union with slavery, I will. If I could save the Union without slavery, I will. If I could slave some areas, free others, I will." So. But anyway, as I write in the article, I said Seward soon got the chance to put his beliefs into practice. An examination of a newspaper report from the era clearly showed that South Carolina and the Confederate government were desperately attempting to avoid the war with the United States government. As late as March 26, 1861, the Union garrison at Fort Sumter, commanded by Robert Anderson, was being allowed to purchase supplies from nearby Charleston. It had been this way since the secession of the state on December 20th, 1860. The March 26, 1861 issue of the Montgomery, Alabama Weekly Mail reported, "There is nothing publicly reliable in relation to the status of Fort Sumter. Vague reports of a contradictory nature are believed and then discredited. We feel satisfied that Fox's visit here and Lamont's also were on the purpose of making arrangements for the evacuation of the fort, but the time when Sumter is to be given up, as far as the public are informed, they weren't sure on that. So what you start seeing is this communication. Basically, Lincoln and Seward are leading South Carolina officials on. In other words, they are acting like they want to be peaceful too, but in the background they are plotting. And it's been this way for as long as I can remember and everything I've studied. What you want to do is start a war without making you look like the aggressor. So I wrote that another article in the same issue of that paper revealed that the Union garrison on Sumter only had about a week of provisions left. Thus, the speculation was that U.S. troops would leave Fort Sumter without military conflict. By April 9th, the paper still had an air of optimism in their coverage. Everything hinged on what action or inaction President Lincoln would take regarding the fort. However, the Memphis Daily Argus on April 9, 1861 reported, "No blockade intended, excitement at Washington, the Southern commissioners, another messenger." A special dispatch to the Charleston Courier dated Washington, April 5th, says information of a decided character are given out in official quarters that the administration does not intend to blockade the ports of the Confederated States in order to collect revenue. Though the endeavors are made to keep every movement a secret, much excitement exists here today in relation to the matters of the South, and thousands of flying rumors keep people on the edge, basically. Many are of the opinion that the crisis has culminated, and dispatches from the South are looked for with great interest. The Confederate commissioners are still of the opinion that Fort Sumter will be evacuated, and say they have the best reason to believe that the administration yet means peace. So the Confederate commissioners went to Washington looking for a guarantee of peace or to work out peace, and evidently to this Memphis Argus article, they seem to be getting that. So in other words, Seward is Secretary of State. They're going to Washington to meet with Lincoln and Lincoln's cabinet, and they're sending back word that I think these people still want to work with us to keep a war from occurring between us. But as I wrote, Lincoln had been stalling for time to prepare contingency plans for whatever confrontation was ahead. He had no desire to surrender the fort. This became obvious by April 10th, when the Fall River, Massachusetts Daily Mail reported that President Lincoln had in fact rejected a meeting with Confederate peace commissioners. The article read as follows: the commissioners appointed by the Southern Confederacy to entreat with the president for a peaceful settlement of existing troubles by acknowledgement of the new government were refused a formal interview by the administration this morning. So now he doesn't want to talk to him. In the same issue of the paper, another article reported a special dispatch from Charleston to the Herald says that authorities of that city have received official notification from the Lincoln administration that supplies will be furnished to Major Anderson, federal commander of Fort Sumter at all hazard. So now you have Lincoln risking war, thinking, well, maybe I'll call their bluff. But even after allowing the federal garrison at Fort Sumter to purchase needed supplies and sending a peace commission to meet with Lincoln and seeing it spurned, Confederate President Jefferson Davis resolved to avoid an armed conflict was immense. The April 11th, 1861 edition of the Cincinnati Daily Press reported that President Davis has telegraphed to Charleston not to fire on any vessels entering Charleston Harbor to supply Fort Sumter with provisions. So you can see this is slowly building here. It's about to boil over. April 12th, 1861, Baltimore, Maryland's Daily Exchange reported that Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard was to meet Major Anderson in another attempt to negotiate a peaceful surrender of Fort Sumter. On April 12, 1861, the Baltimore Sun reported, the Southern Commissioners left for Montgomery today. In their letter to the Honorable William Seward, Secretary of State, they say their mission, having been unsuccessful, they return to an outraged people and express their conviction that war is inevitable. They insist that on the heads of the administration must be the responsibility. Then we move forward to April 13th, 1861. The Times-Picayune, New Orleans, carried the following reproduction of communications between two principal Confederate officers and the Union commander inside the fort, immediately preceding the commencement of hostilities. From Walker, Confederate Secretary of War to P.G.T. Beauregard on April 10th, if you have no doubt of the authorized character of the agent who communicated to you the intention of the government at Washington to supply Fort Sumter by force, you will at once demand its evacuation. If this is refused, proceed in such a manner as you determine to reduce it. Beauregard replies to Pope Walker, April 11th, 1861. He said, Major Anderson has replied as follows to my summons to evacuate the fort. Sir, I have the honor to acknowledge the receipt of your communication demanding the evacuation of this fort, and to say in reply thereto that it is a demand I regret that my sense of honor and obligation to my government prevent my compliance. Major Anderson now adds verbally, I will await the first shot, and if you do not batter us to pieces, we will be starved out in a few days. From Secretary of War Walker to Beauregard, again on April 11th, 1861. Do not desire needlessly to bomb Fort Sumter. If Major Anderson will state the time at which he indicated by him, he will evacuate, and agree in the meantime that he will not use his guns against us unless ours should be employed against Fort Sumter. You are authorized thus to avoid the effusion of blood. If this or the equivalent be refused, reduce the fort in the manner in which you in your judgment decide to be most practicable. Then we have Beauregard to Walker again. Major Anderson will not consent to enter into the engagement you propose or write to you today. From Confederate General Beauregard to Walker, April 12, 1861. We opened on Fort Sumter at 4:30 this morning. P.S. I have intercepted a dispatch which will disclose the fact of Mr. Fox, who had been allowed to visit Major Anderson on the pledge that his purpose was pacific, employed his opportunity to devise a plan for supplying the fort by force. So they didn't fire until they intercepted this message. And I write, the Lincoln administration, with the full cooperation of South-hating Secretary of State William Seward, deceived, delayed, and deliberately misinformed the people of Charleston, South Carolina, Confederate General Beauregard, and the Confederate government, despite the attempts by the Confederate government to avoid war and actively seek a peace solution and act in good faith. Only after General Beauregard intercepted a Union dispatch that revealed the true plans of the Lincoln administration did the Confederates reluctantly fire the first shot on Fort Sumter.
So why do you think it is that they didn't just wait for that forced resupply? Because then effectively they would have had a situation then where the North would have fired the first shot.
Yes, but if it was a forced resupply, then they would have also had those warships to contend with. So maybe they thought.
So did the Confederacy not have enough of a navy at that point to put up a barricade between the ocean and the fort, which was in the harbor?
I don't think the Confederate forces ever had enough of a navy at any time during the war. And just my opinion, as I read through these messages and dispatches, I believe they felt like the message they intercepted was proof enough, and they had better strike while they had the opportunity to.
Open your web browser and type in www.barnesreview.org and discover the Barnes Review magazine. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There is no more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review magazine in its print form, or in convenient electronic delivery. Our host has been a subscriber to both formats for years. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Of course, we all know the outcome of the battle, and we know that it was, I guess you could call it, Beauregard's shining moment. All of his other battlefield exploits were disappointing, to say the least, and he very quickly found himself with a headquarters desk job. Jefferson Davis felt the need to take him off the field before he screwed anything else up.
He screwed up Shiloh, on a pretty monumental level as well. This was definitely Beauregard's shining moment.
So before those Yankee ships had arrived to force the resupply of Fort Sumter, is it safe to say that Fort Sumter was the battle that even Beauregard couldn't lose?
Yeah, you might say that. Even Major Anderson said, if you don't demolish us to pieces, then we'll surrender after we're done, And he knew he knew he didn't have a chance. Anderson did. I don't want to discredit Beauregard too much, but yeah, it's safe to say he wasn't a good battlefield commander.
I mean, so except for the fact that, you could technically say that the Southerners fired the first shots, I mean, there really wasn't much of a conflict there.
Well, unfortunately, they gave the U.S. government what they wanted. Like I said, Seward and Lincoln deceived, delayed, plotted, misinformed, everything they could do right up to the time they said, no, we're not meeting your peace commission. Well, that pretty much gave them the answer they were looking for right there.
See, that's what I've wondered too, and that's why I asked the question I asked a moment ago. Do you think that the message that was intercepted, do you think that was really valid intelligence, or do you think that was just a ruse that was put out there knowing that it would provoke the Southerners to pull the trigger?
I think eventually Lincoln administration would have tried a forced resupply. They had the Navy to do that if they had wanted to. And they were going to get the South to fire a shot one way or the other. That's basically my opinion. But I feel like the dispatch was credible. Maybe it was a ruse, I don't know, but my gut kind of tells me it was credible.
Okay.
I don't think they would have gave the order to fire if they thought it wasn't.
So do you
So,
think there was anything else that either side, but particularly the South, could have done that would have affected a different outcome, or do you think it was inevitable that that the South was just going to have to, was, I guess, going to have to technically start that war?
well, I think it was inevitable. The North was going to get what they wanted, one way or the other. And that's really where the Seward connection comes in. He's giving this speech in Kansas, and he's tying Missouri to the rest of the South and talking about how evil they were and how much Kansas had done for the state of Missouri. And keep in mind, this is not that long after the border wars between Missouri and Kansas, and much damage had been done. Basically, the burning embers were still smoking when he's giving this speech in Kansas. So he knew what he was saying. He meant to rile him up, probably because he knew what's coming down the pike, and his active participation in what was to come.
So do you think
So,
that had Seward not taken such a hostile attitude towards Missouri, would there have been any chance that Missouri might have sided with the Union, or do you think Missouri definitely would have cast her fortunes with the Confederacy regardless?
I think after the St. Louis massacre occurred in 1861, and those Missourians saw their native Missourian, the state guard, being marched through the streets of that city by armed Germans, the die was cast at that point. Anybody who was on the fence at that point quickly got off the fence. I can only imagine. Well, say if something like that happened today, and the federal government federalized some informal Hispanic militias, and we're marching. It doesn't matter what state it is, but was marching native people of your state down the street. I mean, they're clearly foreigners. You're not going to accept that, and it's going to make you angry and want to do something about it. No, I don't think anything could have been done. Now, Seward's speech certainly didn't help. But after the St. Louis massacre in 1861, people's minds were made up at that point.
Okay. So when I go to Missouri today, I go into the Ozarks. Love to go visit the Ozarks. And the people there are definitely very southern-minded people. I would say even, anywhere, say, south or west of, say, Jeff City, people seem to be very southern-minded people. But even when you start to get up around Jeff City and then you get closer to St. Louis, St. Louis, even though it's about, 3 hours from Chicago, you might as well just call it Southwest Chicago. People in St. Louis don't seem to have a southern mindset. But again,
no,
150 years had passed. And so St. Louis, whereas today that northeast corner of the state doesn't really seem to have a southern mentality. They seem to be very Yankee in their mindset. But you're saying that was not the case prior to the war between the states, that those people who were living in that part of the state were still very, very southern-minded.
Yeah, there were secession flags flying in St. Louis during that time. But the federal government quickly seized that city and locked it down.
Okay.
But you have to remember, too, that... give me just a second.
Okay.
don't know what she's barking at out there, but I had to slide the door shut to drown it out a little bit. I put this in my book, Blood in the Ozarks, expanded second edition. Prior to 1848, Missouri was basically settled by people of a Celtic, Scots-Irish culture from North Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. But in 1848, the Marxists in Germany lost their revolution and fled. Some years prior to that, a German traveling through Missouri wrote a book about how much it looked like Germany, and basically that's what drew those people to Missouri. But they brought with them their politics from Germany, and I don't think it's coincidence that once they got here, they were such staunch supporters of Lincoln, because they came from a very Marxist background, and so they readily joined Lincoln's ranks. But
Okay.
you have to remember too, most of them couldn't even speak English. They still spoke German. They had their own German newspapers. And if you were to see your native Missourians, or whatever state you're from, being marched down the street at gunpoint by a federalized militia of nothing but foreigners, it would make you mad enough to go to war too.
So then, and especially given the time period, and people were a lot more gutsy than they are today. If these Germans had taken this so far to the point that they were rounding up the locals, why didn't the locals just kill them?
Because the Germans had the backing of the federal government and the federal army. And I'm sure a lot of them were killed, and it was back and forth. And once the war really kicked off, it just deteriorated quickly here.
Mm-hmm.
So basically in Missouri, a lot of the Confederates from Missouri got sent east. A lot of them came back home because they were hearing that, what was happening at home to their neighbors and their families. Many of them come back home. A lot of them stayed fighting in the east, but many of them come back home, and many more regiments were raised. And but a lot of informal partisan groups on both sides. But I would say then, as now, much of Missouri still identifies as being Southern, with the exception of St. Louis and Kansas City.
Okay. And so the Germans didn't speak the language. They had lived the great majority of their lives in a foreign country across an ocean. And so what were they promised that would cause them to take up arms and basically go after their neighbors, rather than just say, hey, look, we don't know what y'all were doing before we got here, but it ain't our fight?
Well, you have to remember, a lot of them were radicals from Germany, radical Marxists who tried to overthrow their government. And when they fled and came to Missouri, they radically, they naturally embraced Lincoln, because they saw a lot of similarities in what he stood for and what they fought for in Germany.
So did Lincoln promise them the Marxist utopia? I mean, what was their incentive, though?
Not blatantly, but what is Marxism? What is socialism? It's taking money from people and putting it where the government wants. And big projects, railroads, canals. Some of these projects were successful. Most of them weren't. They were boondoggles. But whenever federal money, then just like today, is out there for grabs, people's going to grab it as quickly and as easily as they can. So, people like Lincoln, they were idealists. They wanted a strong central government, and they wanted all these public works projects. Problem with that, the South was paying 80% of the tax revenue through import tariffs. And almost all of that money was going to northern projects. So when people say it was all about slavery, no, it wasn't. I see similarities between then and now. That's why Missouri Department of Transportation still can't get a road tax passed, because people got sick of paying higher taxes and not seeing any improvements locally. It all went to St. Louis and Kansas City. So, things are much different now, but in some ways they're much the same.
So, Marxists tend to not have a moral compass, or at least not one that points anywhere near north. So, what were the Marxist Germans' position on slavery?
They were opposed. Lincoln finally came around to that when it was politically convenient, and when he did it, it didn't free any of the slaves in northern controlled areas. It only freed slaves in areas the North didn't have control over. It was largely a symbolic emancipation.
Extra, read all about it.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Extra, read all about it.
Going back to the article just a little bit, I'm going to ask you to speculate on something. Let's just say that Beauregard could have resisted the urge to pull the trigger. And let's just say that the first shot, if you will, wasn't fired at Fort Sumter. Where then do you think the war would have started? I mean, because the war was inevitable.
You and I have had a similar conversation before, and you could actually say it started in Baltimore, as the Union was coming into Maryland to take possession of that state before they could secede, and they would have seceded. When the Union troops started coming through the city, the citizens attacked them. And I would say, if not Baltimore, possibly St. Louis.
Mm-hmm. I know some have argued that the war had already started in Missouri long before anything was happening to the east.
Well, if you include the border war, then yeah, you might as well tack on another 5 years to the 1861-1865 war in Missouri. Or if you want, you could tack on Reconstruction as well. They didn't call it that here, not outright. They called it the Drake Constitution. But it was every bit as harsh as Reconstruction in the rest of the South. Southerners couldn't vote, couldn't hold office, and that's how the radical Republicans were able to take charge and hold it for so long.
What am I missing here in my questioning? What questions should I be asking you so that you could tell me more about your article, basically?
I just want to emphasize that this speech, in my opinion, the speech by Seward in Kansas, it tells a lot about what was coming. Obviously he wasn't elected president, but he became a cabinet member with immense power. Seward hated the South, by all accounts, from what I could read, and I think there was already a feeling that the South should be conquered before the war ever started. They, again, much like today, people in the South, we tend to mind our own business. We just want to live our lives. We want to be left alone. We're not telling anybody else how to live. But liberals today, they're constantly interfering with our culture, our politics, our way of life, and they feel like it's their duty to tell us how to live. And if we don't want to do that, then they're going to make us. And that was pretty much the way it was back then.
Why do you think it is? Because Massachusetts, for example, had seceded. Back around the time of the Louisiana Purchase.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it was Southerners who had kind of compelled them to come back into the Union. And so, why is it that they couldn't just be allowed to go? I mean, because essentially, had that been allowed, then when it came time for Southern states to want to secede, the precedent would have already been set. Why do you think that it is that on either side, it's like people just don't have the good sense to say good riddance and let things be and just let people move along?
Well, part of it probably, again, like now, the liberal mindset is it's not okay for you to do it, but it is okay for us. And I think that's the way it was then, too. People of the Northeast had talked about seceding before themselves, and it was okay for them to think about it. But it's not okay for people they don't agree with to do it. And in the case of the war between the states, as I stated before, 80% of the tax revenue was coming from the South. So, and I don't know how big of a role the South really played in compelling Massachusetts to stay. Mm-hmm. But I can't imagine it would have been with more force than what the federal government used. Just a lot of similarities. I mean, things have changed so much, but in like that old saying goes, the more things change, the more they stay the same. And we're still being attacked, only they're doing it in different ways. Certain edicts that were handed down during the quote-unquote COVID lockdowns, they even tried to tell people they couldn't go to church. But yet you see all these politicians who got caught, all these liberal politicians who got caught at these parties, at the hair salon, not a mask on, not locked down. And then, why is it, here's a question for you. Why is it that Antifa and Black Lives Matter can burn entire cities down? Entire cities, basically. And they're not called terrorists. But 200 people go around basically for a selfie tour through the Capitol building, and they're declared insurrectionists.
Well, basically, whoever controls the news sources controls the narrative, and
yeah, and that's kind of interesting too, because a lot of these newspaper archives, the way the South is portrayed in many newspapers before the war is much different than after the war started.
Well, prior to the war, you had very partisan newspapers. Most newspapers were very tightly affiliated with a political party. And, of course, that very much prejudiced their reporting. But you knew it. You know, that was called the Arkansas Democrat Gazette. You knew what party they were affiliated with.
Yep.
And if you didn't want to read the Democrat Gazette, then you read the Whig newspaper or the Republican newspaper.
Yeah. But, you know, what happened during the war? Mm-hmm. If it was a paper that was critical of the government, Lincoln shut it down.
Yeah, and so after the war, then there were no media outlets, if you will, that were still...
Right.
Yeah.
And, man alive. I can't remember which president it was. It was a presidential election in the late 1800s, I believe. And it was a contested election. And the only way that Union troops were pulled from the South is the Democrats said, okay, we'll give the election to the Republican if all the federal troops are pulled out of our state. And a bargain was struck. And that is the only thing that got those troops out of our states. Just an interesting tidbit.
So what do you think made South Carolina the point of contention? I mean, there were a number of places where the Yankees could have drawn the first blood or could have basically lured out the first shot. Why Fort Sumter?
South Carolina was the first to secede. So they blamed South Carolina. You know, that was all part of Sherman's march to the sea, too. That was still retribution. Marched through Atlanta and South Carolina, North Carolina, burning everything down he could find, destroying everything he could find. And, you know, in a way, that's one reason the commander of I'm drawing a blank. The fort in Georgia, Fort Andersonville. The commander,
Wirtz.
What was his name? Wirtz. He was blamed for starving those troops when in fact he did everything he could to feed them. But thanks to Sherman destroying everything, destroying all the crops, he couldn't even feed his guards. But after the war, they blamed Wirtz and hung him. When the real person responsible for that was William Tecumseh Sherman.
And Wirtz wasn't even a military officer. He was a physician.
Yeah.
Who was basically forcefully conscripted and placed into a command that he didn't want. Thus freeing up an actual military man to go off and fight.
Well, there was actually, documentation where Wirtz is trying to get these Union POWs help, trying to get them through, trying to do something about the situation. It was out of his hands. But
well, I know he had tried to strike a deal with Grant, but for whatever reason, Grant refused. I mean, at one point, he was even offering to just literally open up the gates of the prison and, let them go free. All Grant had to do was just have a train waiting at the nearby train tracks for them to get onto. And Grant basically, turned away his own men.
Yeah, because they knew they had more troops to spare and the South didn't. And that was their policy. They stopped prisoner exchanges because of that reason. It was a war of attrition. But still, that wasn't Wirtz's fault.
Right.
He was just unlucky enough to be in command.
So I have one more question for you.
Okay.
General Beauregard was a Louisiana boy. What in the world was he doing in South Carolina to begin with? What even had him there?
Maybe that's an article for, maybe that's a future article. That is a good question, though. But I guess a lot of people were drawn there. Like maybe the Confederate government sent him there.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I can think of. But yeah, it's just weird how little things in history that seem like not that big of a deal at first tend to be make or break historic events later.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say this: I think he tried to keep from firing on Fort Sumter, but when he intercepted that message, that was the last straw. They knew the Navy would be coming soon, and they would have to fight them too. So why not fight the fort at one portion, and the Navy another time?
And so what was it about Fort Sumter that for generations had so many Southerners naming their children Beauregard?
Well, I guess he was considered the hero.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was in command.
Mm-hmm.
He took the fort, so
there was nothing else in Beauregard's career that was outstanding, and so it must have just been something about Fort Sumter.
Yeah, well, technically, first battle of the war, technically the first win of the war for the South. So things like that, people tend to remember them.
Yeah. And of course, General Beauregard was not the only disappointing Beauregard. There was another more modern disappointing Beauregard, and that was our Attorney General of a few years ago, Jeffrey Beauregard Sessions.
Oh, I didn't realize his middle name was Beauregard. Yeah, he turned out to be a great disappointment, and yeah, I don't know if you remember what leaked out, what Trump told him after he recused himself. It was pretty funny. Yeah. That man was such a disappointment. He acted like he had no power. When Obama was in there, his attorney general did whatever he wanted. And so, very disappointing.
I always wondered what they had on him.
Sessions?
Yeah.
There's no telling. I mean, did they have something, or was he just somebody we thought that had a backbone that was just another spineless politician?
Well, honestly, when he came out so strong for Trump early in the campaign, there was part of me that wondered if he wasn't a plant. It's like, is this guy really what he's saying he is right now? And then when he became Attorney General, my early suspicions were very confirmed. And then, and obviously he killed himself politically by betraying the president, because when he ran for Senate again, he couldn't even beat a third-rate football coach.
Everybody that stayed loyal to Trump took care of them in the end. Mm-hmm. Everybody that betrayed him, well, they're not in good positions right now.
Well, if you look at the Republican Party, all of the Republicans who turned on Barry Goldwater, which was probably 2/3 of the party, it was the end of all of their political careers, basically. In fact, Mitt Romney should have learned his lesson and known not to be a never Trumper, because his dad was a never Goldwater. And he saw his dad lose his political capital and career in opposing Goldwater, and he should have known better than to go after Trump in the same manner. But again, what we're going to see in the Republican Party 15 years from now is just as everybody who had opposed Goldwater was politically dead at that point and didn't get reelected, didn't get reappointed, I mean, it's even part of the reason why Gerald Ford became Nixon's vice president, and not Rockefeller, because Rockefeller was one of those who had strongly opposed Goldwater. But you had Nixon and Reagan were the two big leaders in the Republican Party who supported Goldwater when everybody else was against him. And they were the ones who became president. And all of the Republicans who opposed Goldwater were politically dead at that point. And so what we're gonna see is 15, 20 years from now is the Mitt Romneys and the Mitch McConnells and the Jeff Sessionses. You know, anybody who betrayed or opposed President Trump is probably not even going to be on the political scene. We're going to have a hard time remembering their names. And you're going to see just a few people, you know, maybe a Ted Cruz. You're going to see just a few people. And they'll be the leadership of the struggling Republican Party. Tell us, how's the publishing business doing?
I've devoted a lot of time on the website of digging into local history archives and stuff, and that's starting to get a lot of traction. But
and so that's foothillsmedia.net.
Yep, foothillsmedia.net. We post some alternative news on there, and just for entertainment, I got a link up to a Texas Red Dirt country music station. If you scroll down far enough, you can click and listen to that. Here's some real country music, not this stuff that we're forced to listen to on the radio. I try to put a little bit of everything on there for people. And
so what other irons do you have in the fire right now, Clint? Are you working on any new books?
A book on local history from this county. There seems to be a lot of interest in it.
Okay.
So the funny thing is you get people that say, you need to talk to so-and-so, you need to do that, you need to include this. And it's like, who's writing this book?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to cut it off there because we are just about out of time for this week's TBR Radio Presents, the TBR History Hour. The truth is most of the rest of the conversation from that phone call was personal back and forth between Clint and I. I came into possession of a video clip the other day, and it was from CNS News. And it was a CNN segment between Morgan Freeman and Don Lemon. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it down even smaller because I want to fit it within what the federal law calls the fair use doctrine so that CNN doesn't try to sue us for copyright infringement. And so I'm going to play you just enough of a segment that we won't step on any of their copyrights. Again, it's called the fair use doctrine. Look it up on the internet if you'd like to. But Morgan Freeman schools Don Lemon when Don Lemon tries to play the race card.
Do you think that race plays a part in wealth distribution, or either a mindset that you can't
Today?
or cannot? Yeah.
No,
You don't?
no, I don't. You and I, we're proof. Why would race have anything to do with it? Put your mind to what you want to do and go for that. I was born in Memphis, Tennessee. I had a long haul from where I came from to here, but here we are.
Right.
So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and here we sit at the dining table.
But it's hard to, when you say that to some people, because they say, oh, there you go with a pull yourself up by the bootstraps thing, and, you know, you're just being respectable. Not everybody can do that.
Everybody can.
Very wise and encouraging words from Morgan Freeman, and we will end our show today on those words. Next week, we'll be back, same time, same place. We'll have another great show for you. Until then, would you go to our website, www.barnesreview.org, www.barnesreview.org. You can check out that great March-April issue of TBR Magazine that Clint Lacy and I were talking about on today's show. You can also go to the TBR bookstore, and you can pick up some great reading materials there as well. If you're not a subscriber to the Barnes Review Magazine, you should be. It is the greatest revisionist history magazine in print anywhere in the world today, and we have a special offer for you. It's available on our website, barnesreview.org. You can become a subscriber to both the print and electronic PDF editions all at the same time. So check out the Barnes Review. Anyways, I've got to go, but I will talk to you again next week. God bless.